Episode 183 of CppCast with guest Kris Jusiak, recorded January 16th, 2019. Today's sponsor of CppCast is PVS Studio. PVS Studio is a tool for bug detection in the source code of programs written in C, C++, and C#. PVS Studio team will also release a version that supports analysis of programs written in Java. In this episode, we talk about the next big thing. Then we talk to Kris Jusiak. Kris talks to us about his DI and SML libraries that have been proposed to Boost. Welcome to episode 183 of CppCast, the first podcast for C++ developers by C++ developers. I'm your host, Rob Irving, joined by my co-host, Jason Turner. Jason, how you doing today?
Pretty good, Rob. Getting ready for C++ on C coming up, making sure all that's ready, and yeah.
That's coming up in what, 2-3 weeks now?
Yeah, the conference is in 3 weeks.
Well, I'm looking forward to hearing how this conference goes for its first time. I'm sure it'll be good. Phil Nash does a good job with everything he does, so I'm sure it'll be a good conference.
And talking to Phil, it looks like things are going well. The conference is going to be pretty impressive for the first year. And I've got a fair number of students signed up for my class. It's looking pretty good.
Awesome. Well, at the top of every episode, I like to read a piece of feedback. This week, we got this tweet from Titus Winters that he sent a day or two ago. And he's referencing our episode last week with Arthur O'Dwyer, saying, in this week's CppCast episode, Arthur made an offhand comment about C++ needing to move to fewer releases in order to ensure things are baked properly. That's backward. You get proper bake time when you take away release pressure, small, frequent releases. And yeah, I definitely like the current 3-year cycles. I'd be sad if we didn't have something to look forward to every 3 years. At least that's my perspective on things.
And if nothing else, it keeps those of us doing training employed.
Yeah. Keeps us making content, have lots of stuff to talk about.
Yeah, could you imagine if there was only a new standard like every 12 years? What would we be talking about on the podcast?
I really have no idea. I don't think we could do this show if it was 12 years away. And that's, maybe another thing that is good about the 3-year cycle. It keeps the community more active.
That's almost certainly true.
Conferences more interesting.
Before 2011, for all intents, at least from my perspective, it seemed like there wasn't a C++ community.
Yeah, I agree.
There's like a conference, pretty much.
Yeah, and there was like the Boost conference, of course. That's where maybe most of the activity was happening.
Yeah, and that's the one I'm referring to. That's the one I went to, 2009?
Right.
Something like that.
Well, yeah, so I guess we're in agreement that we like the 3-year cycles.
Yeah, but we're biased.
We are biased. Well, we'd love to hear your thoughts about the show as well. You can always reach out to us on Facebook, Twitter, or email us at feedback@cppcast.com. And don't forget to leave us a review on iTunes. Joining us today is Kris Jusiak. Kris is a C++ software engineer who currently lives a couple doors down from CppCon 2019. He has worked in different industries over the years, including telecommunications, games, and most recently finance for QuantLab Financial. He has an interest in modern C++ development with a focus on performance and quality. He is an open source enthusiast with multiple open source libraries where he uses template metaprogramming techniques to support the C++ rule, don't pay for what you don't use. Whilst trying to be as declarative as possible with the help of domain-specific languages, Kris is also a keen advocate of extreme programming techniques, test behavior-driven development, and truly believes that the only way to go fast is to go well. Kris, welcome to the show.
Yeah, hello guys. Thanks for having me.
So you said you live a couple of doors down from CppCon 2019. I guess this is the part of the disclosure where we point out that you are also one of the attendees of the meetup here in Denver. So you'll be, at this point, like the fourth person I think that we've had on who goes to my meetup. Well, if I can call it my meetup. It's really a group effort, but it's great to have you on, Kris.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, Kris, we got a couple news articles to discuss. Feel free to comment on any of these, and then we'll start talking about some of the libraries you're working on, okay?
Okay.
Okay, so this first one is Meeting C++ 2018 has started posting videos. So far, I think just the keynotes, or 3 keynotes, and this one other lightning talk are the first ones to go up.
And a deleted video.
I don't know if
That's
bad.
sad.
Yeah, that is sad.
Yeah, that was the keynote, right?
I'm sorry?
Yeah, that was the Andre's keynote, which was deleted at some point.
Oh, okay.
Andre is still there.
Well,
yeah,
no, he might have.
It was re-uploaded. Yeah.
Oh,
Right.
okay.
Yeah, that's difficult in YouTube to manage. Like, if you have to correct a video or something, there's no clean way to do it.
Yeah. And you can't just remove it from the playlist, I guess?
You should be able to remove it from the playlist.
Okay.
Yeah, Yen should be able to do that.
Well, I did watch Andre's keynote so far, and there's also keynotes from Lisa Lippincott and Nikolai Juszczak, so I plan on watching those soon. But do you guys have a chance to watch any of these yet?
I haven't yet. Have you, Kris?
Yeah, I did watch all of them. They're pretty good.
Yeah, I need to get back around to this. It's kind of funny that there's only one lightning talk up, but yeah. I mean, just looking at the times, hour and a half, 5 minutes.
Well, Jason, you'll probably find Andre's keynote to be interesting. He talked a lot about if constexpr, which we'll talk about again in a moment with our other news article, but you'll probably find that interesting.
Yeah, and I should watch it, yeah, and we'll talk about it like you said. So I only know what other people are saying about the talk at the moment, which will be an interesting way into going into it. And also for our listeners who don't know, at least some of the keynotes at Meeting C++ have 120-minute time slots. So Andre's here is an hour and 54 minutes.
Yeah.
That is a really long keynote.
I think I don't remember exactly how long the keynote presentation itself was. I think it might have been closer to an hour and a half with 20, 30 minutes of questions.
Right. Yeah, that's probably the smart way to do it. As a presenter, plan for an hour and a half. Yeah.
Well, since we just referenced this article, let's talk about if constexpr isn't broken, which is a response to Andre's The Next Big Thing keynote. And yeah, so he talked about what was the word DBI? Do you remember what he called it?
Static if?
Kris? No.
Well, he was talking about the defects per line of code, right?
Yeah, but he kept talking about the use of static if or if constexpr as DBI or something based introspection. I can't remember. Or design-based introspection,
Oh,
right?
design introspection, yeah.
Yeah. So he was talking a lot about that and showing that, I guess, in D, using static if, you can do all this great introspection, and he thinks if constexpr should work the same way, but according to the proposal, it doesn't. But this is an interesting post pointing out how, according to Andre, you can't do all these things with if constexpr that you could do with static if and D, but this author is pointing out that there are other ways to achieve pretty much everything he does in his D library that makes heavy use of static if.
Well, I think Andre's point is a bit different, actually. I think he's trying to point out that in D, you can make it the design by introspection, which just requires a few things like the introspection, verify the methods, and after that also the generation. You can do all of those things in C++ as well. However, I think the main point he's making is the fact that the number of bugs per line of code, it's constant despite the language. So it's like 15 or 50 or like between 15 and 50 per 1,000 lines of code.
Yeah.
So the less code you have to write, the better. And with static if, obviously you can achieve those things in the with the less lines of code than in C++, in which you can do all of those things, as the article says, besides the generation, which we don't have at the moment.
That's true. What do you think about this, Jason, as someone who hasn't watched Andre's talk yet?
I feel like, okay, this conversation about the ranges example that we had 2 weeks ago and the week before, right? Where we're all like, well, ultimately the conclusion is that this is a terrible example. Now, and I'm looking, I read this article and I was looking through these examples and his just the direct comparison, because like we said, I haven't seen Andre's talk, but him saying, well, we can actually do most of the things that we want to do with if constexpr. And I'm looking at this and I'm like, the number of times that I've had to write code with this complexity in C++ where I have this many different ways that I need to control the behavior of a function has been like 3 in like 20 years.
Right.
And I'm like,
I think that's a really valid point. Sorry for breaking you, Jason.
No, that's fine.
I think that's a really valid point you made. However, what Andrej is proposing is like he made like the policy by design famous before, and he's actually proposing design by introspection as a way of, new way of developing software. So it's kind of a new approach in which you have to do the static if kind of things to achieve it.
So if I hear you, you're saying, well, if we come to fully understand this new approach, then it might just change the way in general that we write software?
Yeah, basically, yeah. So for example, at QuantLab, we are using design by introspection quite a lot, besides the generation part. So, we verify the existence of members and stuff like that so that we can have a kind of a generic interface, but at compile time. So it's a bit different than, for example, if you use the virtual interface and things like that. But, there are pros and cons.
Right. Yeah, and the more we can do at compile time in general, the better.
Right.
Yeah.
I agree.
Okay. And then the last article we have here is there's the C++ Now submission deadline, which is coming up on January 23rd, I think. So that's 1 week from today that we're recording. So you'll have a couple days left after you hear this episode to submit your talk to C++ Now.
Yes, and try to not be late. I know like 50% of the submissions come in like the day after the final date or something ridiculous.
Right.
I mean, that's just a given with conferences. I know enough conference organizers. Don't do that to our conference organizers. Get the submissions in, please.
It's very true. They work very hard.
Yes.
Be nice to them. And the other dates to keep in mind are proposal decisions are going to be sent out February 25th, and the program will be online March 17th.
I assume you all are planning to go, Kris, and by you all I mean your crew at QuantLab, who we've had Lenny on recently.
Yes, definitely. It's a big conference to be so, and it's really close, so yeah, definitely we will be there.
It is very close. And off topic, but have you made the drive from Denver up to Aspen yet on any of your previous trips?
Yes, I did.
Okay. That is definitely a drive worth doing. And for anyone else who's listening, some people make the decision to fly to Denver, rent a car, and drive to Aspen just to experience driving through Colorado. And it's something to think about if you're going to come to the conference for sure.
Yeah, definitely recommending.
How long is the drive?
3 hours or something.
But very scenic.
Oh, quite.
Yeah.
You see everything that Colorado has to offer, from the plains to the high desert and the Rocky Mountains, and then forest in between, and a couple of rivers. Yeah.
Okay, so Kris, do you want to tell us a little bit about the 2 libraries you're currently maintaining?
Sure. I actually maintain 4 libraries at the moment, but it's a lot of work and hard to keep up as well. But the ones which we want to cover are the Dependency Injection Library and the State Machine Library. So, yeah.
Well, then what are the other 2? Yeah. Sorry.
So the other 2 are, one is for the type erasure. So, we have quite a few of them, like in Boost type erasure, Dino from Louis Dion, and others. So I wrote my own as well. And there is, because why not? Obviously, I claim it's better in some ways. And the other one is a GUnit, which is a wrapper for Google Test, which allows you to do things more like in a catch-to style. And also, I added support for Gherkin. If you follow BDD, you might find it useful as well.
Right.
So since you mentioned Boost, you do refer to both these libraries, the 2 Dependency Injection and the State Machine Library, as Boost libraries, but they're not officially Boost libraries, right?
Right. I actually do not refer exactly as a Boost. I'm trying to put like quotes or square brackets around Boost. But yeah, that's a valid point. As a disclaimer, they are not in Boost, official Boost released, but they were created as being accepted at some point in the future. So they follow all the Boost guidelines, and that's why I call them Boost, because there's like no Boost staging kind of approach in Boost before they got merged. So,
do they also require Boost?
No, actually, any of my libraries do not require Boost, neither STL. So it's just one header usually, which is generated, and just copy the header and you can use the library without STL or Boost. You just need a C++14 compiler. That's all what you need.
So I have a question I just thought of before we move into actually discussing the specifics of any of these libraries. Is with 4 open source libraries, how much difficulty do you have in keeping them like up to date as compilers are growing and changing and like going back? I'm assuming if it's anything like any of my libraries that you have workarounds for certain compilers and whatever and some of the code, and then you realize, oh, okay, now that GCC 8 just came out, I can go and remove some workarounds or something. Do you manage to find time to keep all that kind of thing up to date?
Yeah, I'm trying, especially for the DI and SML. I'm trying to keep on top of that. And as you pointed out, there's a lot of workarounds which have to be, handled at some point and fixed afterwards. So it's a lot of work. I also support Visual Studio, which adds 10 times work as well on top of that. So yeah, it's quite difficult and it takes a lot of time. I would say like making the Travis pass for all the compilers is like 50% of time you spend on the library when you actually maintain it after developing. So yeah, it's a lot of work.
Do you, how easily or how, I don't know how to phrase this question. You have to drop support for older compilers at some point. And Visual Studio, honestly, with as fast as it's changing, it's the easiest one to drop. Be like, never mind, you have to have at least Visual Studio 15.4 or whatever the latest release is. Do you do that? Do you keep dropping off old compilers?
Yes. I'm trying to support, I'm trying to keep it, quite modern, but also not that, also I'm trying to keep the C++14 support for all of them, which means that it's like Visual Studio 2015 and Clang 3.8 or 3.6 and 5 upwards. Yeah.
Okay, that's, relatively old compilers to be maintaining at this point.
So one more question about Boost before we move on. Have you actually submitted them to Boost for acceptance?
Yeah, well, they were on the review schedule. However, I never found the review manager for them. So maybe a shameless plug. If you hear that and you would like any of those after what I will, we'll be talking about in the sec, feel free to contact me and we can arrange the review manager part for it.
So you are interested in getting them accepted if it goes down that road?
Yes, I am. I still am. Although it's like, I don't think like, maybe it's a bit controversial, but it's like in this day and age, Boost release, it's not as important since we have GitHub and GitLab, and it's much easier to plug libraries using Conan and other package managers. But I still feel that like Boost is important and helps a lot of companies. So yeah, would love them to be part of it officially.
Okay. So let's start off by talking about the dependency injection library, and maybe we could start by just having you explain exactly what dependency injection is. Right.
Yeah, that's a good question, which I, hear a lot of times, because when I, developed the library, it's like a lot of people trying to figure out why you'd even care, what's that? So DI is actually a kind of mysterious concept, which, grew a lot over the years, but it's very simple. It's all about the construction. It came from the object-oriented patterns, but it's kind of useful in all paradigms. And when I say it's all about the construction, it's basically the idea that if you use the constructors, you probably use some form of the DI already. It's also called and referred sometimes as Hollywood principle. So it means like, don't call us, we'll call you. And it's like, depending on what you actually pass by the constructors, it depends whether you use the DI correctly or not. So for example, there's like this anti-pattern, which is called service locator, which means that you pass in only one thing, one constructor parameter to all your objects, which will be like referred as a God object, and you pass it around. So that's not really a DI, although you can say, I'm using constructors, so it's like I'm using DI. No, that's not really a good DI. That's not the idea about DI.
That's more like one giant global state.
Yeah, or like, you pass the service locator, you can resolve your dependencies, but you do it afterwards And then it's like you really couple to the service locator, and you don't want to be coupled. Like DI is not about coupling; it's actually the opposite. The other problem you may have with the DI is that, like when you carry dependencies, so it means that you pass things to the constructor which you not use immediately. So for example, you have the service which you pass and you don't use it, but you have the other object which is which you dependent on, and you pass it through as well to that object. So that's bad as well. That's not really a proper DI. And that's actually called the law of Demeter. It's a design guideline in which you should only talk to your immediate friends. So you can see that you don't follow that rule when you have a lot of, dots in your code. So for example, if you have you have a class object in which you say dot get, dot value. If you have a lot of dots, it means that you carry dependencies somehow, and that's not a good pattern either. The other way you can screw up DI is by using singletons. Singletons on their own may be a bit controversial and not that terrible, as long as you inject them. But if you don't inject them, and you use, them directly in your code, that's really bad from the testing perspective, because you can't really test them. It's really hard to fake them because they couple to your code. So you don't want to do that either. One more thing about the DI, which you don't want to use as well, is the non-named parameters. So that's quite, regularly often said about it recently. So for example, if you have rectangle and you have width and height as an int, 2 ints, you don't want to use 2 ints for them because the name actually doesn't matter in C++. So if you do int width, int height, you can have different names in header and the definition of the file. And if you swap them around, it doesn't really matter. So you may have like ABI changes, like saddlebags because of that.
Right.
And so it's much better, and it's much better for DI as well, because you can directly inject named things like the strong type defs. So that's really, really good for DI. And the last thing is the dependency inversion, which is a concept in which you don't want to depend on the abstractions, on concrete implementations, sorry. You want to depend on the abstractions, because if I have to say there's one rule about this, there's nothing is certain in software development except for bugs and constantly changing requirements, I'd say. So it's obvious that you'll at some point have to change the classes or an object you are injecting. So if you depend on the concrete implementations, you couple yourself so that you won't be able to easily change that. So that's important to keep in mind, so that you will depend on the abstractions instead. And the final thing I wanted to mention about the DI, since sorry, it is like a bit long, but okay. I'm trying to point out the things which are important from my perspective, is the composition root. So the composition root is the unique place in an app when modules are combined together. So you know that you use and apply DI correctly if you have the main and you say, create me an app. That's my app. And you don't have to, do anything else to create any other object. So for example, if you have classes which do create objects themselves, so if you see make unique within your classes, then it means that you didn't follow the DI and you don't have the composition root. And that obviously makes the testing difficult, and it's not really loosely coupled code. So that's bad from the DI perspective in a sense. And DI has like a lot of benefits, but the main ones are the fact that it produces a loosely coupled code, so that you can easily test it in isolation. You can separate the modules and develop them separately, and it separates the business logic and object creation. And also the testability, which is the main part, which DI gives you. It's like if you follow TDD or BDD, with TDD you can easily inject the mocks for DI. With BDD you can have different configurations for the production and for, testing environment. So yeah, that's the main benefits of DI.
Okay, so the first thing that, hearing everything you said, and you said singletons are terrible, basically, unless you pass them in as a dependency, and right. Because of testability and everything else. First thing that comes to mind is logger, because it's the thing that everyone wants to make a singleton. And does that apply to the dependency injection mindset, and how?
Yeah, I think it applies to DI mindset, as you pointed out. So if you use the framework, which we'll get to in a sec,
right,
then you don't really have to think about it, because you just say in your constructor that I need a logger, and then you can use the logger within your functions because it will be injected for you. You don't have to really think about it. But that will give you the idea, or the ability to easily test it and fake it. I'm not sure whether testing the logger output is a good idea.
Yeah.
Right.
But, having a singleton and trying to fake it, it's quite difficult. But, that's one of examples which you may do both. I would still use DI for that. I would pass it via constructor, but I wouldn't be a strong opponent if you don't really want to do that, if it comes to the logger. But, because usually you have a macro or something like that. Either way. So yeah, it depends. But logger is a good example in which you may don't want to use DI directly, but I would still encourage that because it gives you the ability to fake it and possibly test it or do whatever you want with it.
Right, because if you're not using DI with something like a logger, then first of all, you have to create a concrete logger singleton before running a unit test, because if that unit test hits the logger and doesn't have a singleton, it's going to have a problem.
Right. Right. You'll have problems if you use singletons either way.
Right.
Unless you inject them, then you may have less problems. But yeah, singletons are bad in general, but there are use cases for them. And I would encourage everyone to inject them so that your unit tests or other tests, your integration tests will be clean.
So do you want to tell us a little bit about your DI library?
Sure. So DI is quite nice concept, in my opinion, because it gives you a lot of flexibility with your design and produces a loosely coupled code. But there's like an issue with it, because when you approach the manual DI, which means that, you have a lot of classes because you follow the solid principles and mainly the single responsibility principle, because you want to have, small classes which you will inject. You don't want service locators. So that means that you will have a lot of them. And if you have a lot of them, you'll have to create a lot of them in the main, let's say, if you follow the composition route and, pass them through. And obviously that will cause a lot of problems for you because the order will be important. If you change, shared pointer to unique pointer, you will have to change that. It's quite a lot of work just to maintain that. And when I'm saying quite a lot of work, you can see the projects which have hundreds of thousands of lines of code of that wiring. And then, developers are lazy by default, I'd say, and they don't want to, over design and stuff like that. So it's often you will break the single responsibility principle by having a hack, because I will just extend it a bit because I'm in rush. I have this, fix to make because it's difficult because I have to maintain all this wiring mess. Mm-hmm. And that's where actually, the framework comes handy. And the framework I developed is it's called Boost with quotes, DI, as we pointed out before. And it's and it is a C++ take on a popular frameworks in other languages like Java and C#. DI is way more popular in those languages than in C++. And I think there are a few reasons for that. One is that they're more object-oriented only kind of languages. C++ is more about multiple paradigms. And just to mention that DI might be applied for functional programming as well. You can have functional DI where you inject functions, not necessarily objects, but the concept is the same. And the framework itself follows the rule that don't pay for what you don't use. So I'm trying to make it as compile-time as possible. And the main idea for DI framework in general is to automate the wiring mess and do more things. But it's this wiring mess, which I mentioned a few minutes ago about the manual DI, when you have in main, when you follow the composition route and you have to instantiate all the classes, pass them through the constructors to one object, and after that create the other object, pass it through all the constructors. And I said it's there might be quite a lot of them. So DI, the idea behind the framework is that you say, create me the app, and DI will figure out all the constructor parameters, all the templates, everything for you, and will just create an app for you. So you don't have to deal with that, wiring mess. It will be totally automated for you. So that's the main principle of the framework on its own. And on top of that, there are like few benefits of using it. So the main one would be the performance. So by default, there's no runtime overhead with the BoostDI library because it generates the same code as you would generate by writing it by hand.
Okay.
Like make unique or, having a class and just, moving objects. But in most cases, actually, it can generate better code because it knows all the objects which have to be created, right? So it can, create a different layout, combine objects together which should be together, allocate the memory up front for objects and stuff like that. So all of that might be analyzed and by the DI at compile time, because that's the idea behind the BoostDI, and it gives you better performance. What is actually funny about it is like I made a lot of benchmarks regarding the compilation times because I was like really scared that C++ will do it C++ way, but it's like it will compile C++ way, meaning forever.
Right.
But actually, if you compare the BoostDI to a different library in Java, which is called Dagger2, it compiles faster than Java. So because the Java Dagger2 is actually generated by, they have these annotations and they have the parser, which you go the code through and try to find the annotations and generates the code out of that. And then you recompile that code. So it's like a step before the proper compilation.
Right.
Like preprocessor kind of thing. And that actually compiles slower than BoostDI with the same example. So that's quite handy in my opinion. So to sum up a bit of the library, the main benefits of using it is the fact that it reduces the boilerplate because you don't have to do all this wiring yourself. You don't have to, write it yourself. And you can easily refactor the code as well. So if you change the constructor parameters, if you do the manual DI, you would have to change the wiring mess again, find which object, what order it has to be passed through. Maybe the order of the dependency changed. So you have to go through all of that. And that's, as I pointed out before, may lead to workarounds. With DI, that will be automated and you don't have to, think about it at all. And on top of that, it's non-intrusive, which is something I'm really actually proud of. It's an idea how to deduce the constructor parameters out of the classes. So obviously in C++, a constructor is not a function, so
right.
You have to do the function traits on it. But there are ways in which you use some TMP tricks like implicit template conversion operator, and you do small magic with if is constructible stuff. You can actually verify the constructor parameters, and that's important because you don't want the framework to be you don't want to rely on the framework. So it's often a case with DI frameworks that you depend on the framework itself by using annotations or macros. It's like you have to, instead of having normal constructor, you have to pass, inject macro or annotate it like with add inject in Java. And that's not ideal because you couple yourself to the DI framework. And DI is all about loosely coupled code. So why would you actually couple yourself to DI framework? That doesn't make sense, right? Because you can't create, for example, the objects without, having those annotations or macros. So with BoostDI, you don't have to change your code at all in 99% of cases. And you just say, create me an app and it will just do it for you.
So you say create an app and you pass in the type that you want it to create as a template parameter?
The type you want to create, yeah. It depends on, it will create the object graph, without any problems. However, if you have polymorphism of some sort like templates, concepts, inheritance, variant, or type erasure, you would have to add the binding, the wiring, what that kind of an interface concept has to be bound to. So, for example, if you have an interface iLogger, let's say, not the best example, but let's say if you have iLogger and you would like to bind it to, file logger, you would have to say bind iLogger to file logger, for example. Or if you have a concept or template, which you can use DI with as well, you just say the class logger, concept logger bind to, file logger or something like that. But yeah, that's all what you have to actually write down explicitly. You don't have to write down that this class takes these constructor parameters. You just say these polymorphic types have to be bound to that, and I'm fine. Just create me it somehow by going through all the object graph for that given type, find out all the constructor parameters, create all of them, and pass the required polymorphic types into them as well.
Okay. Are there any performance implications to looking up all your DI objects with this object graph?
Right. So I kind of mentioned that already a bit, but no, there's actually no performance implication. The negative implications of using it. Actually, there are positive implications of using it because you can have a better cache layout for it, or better memory layout, and combine types together, and yeah, you might get better performance by using it. But it obviously depends on DI applications, because a lot of programs actually do not require DI to be as fast because it doesn't start up, for example. So you usually create objects at startup and when you don't care, right?
Right.
But it's sometimes important when you want to create some objects afterwards. So you wanna always be as fast as possible. But it also depends on your application. So with BoostDI you can have both. You can have no runtime overhead, or a runtime overhead if you want to have something totally runtime kind of base. If you want to bind the dependencies and runtime. So for example, kind of a Java style, you have an XML file and you want to wire things accordingly to what you have in that file at runtime. You can do that with BoostDI as well, but then, if you can't create them, you'll throw an exception or do whatever you want with that, which is a runtime error, which BoostDI is not about. BoostDI is about compile time guarantee of objects creation. So the idea is that if it compiles, it means that I can pass some objects to it. So for example, if you miss the binding for a polymorphic type, BoostDI won't compile, and it will give you hopefully a nice error that, did you forget to bind this interface or concept? Because it's abstract and I can't really create that, so it will give you a compile time error.
And I hate to ask, but is it a readable compile time error?
Yes, I would say yes. I
mean, it's C++.
I spent a lot of time trying to achieve as the best error possible. So in most cases, it will give you a 3-line kind of error.
Oh, wow.
With where it's the call was made for the create, and after that you couldn't, this type cannot be created because it's abstract, and it gives you a hint that did you consider binding an interface to an implementation. And to achieve that, I'm using kind of a trick with the linking part of the application. Because by default, if you do a static assert, unless you will do the static assert on the kind of a call side, you will get all the call stack.
Right.
And you don't want that. So the way I'm doing it, I'm having a deprecated create method, which will give you the first call stack, just the first one, that this method is deprecated, which is the create, which means, and I also put the constraint is not satisfied, so it kind of imitates the concept part. And after that is go through all the program, and when it cannot create the type because it's not bound or it's not creatable from some reason, I have the inline cons expr static function without a definition, in which instead of static assert, which says error, this type cannot be bound or cannot be created, And that actually gives you a warning, which I turn into an error by diagnostic. And then I get the second line of the error. So it's like the qualified by the deprecated attribute. And after that, the error on its own by the inline missing definition kind of the function. So that's the idea behind it. And in most cases, it gives you 2-3 lines of error. However, it's more complicated when you bind templates. But yeah, I won't go to that because it's not as good. But by default, if you use standard things like variant or, type erasure, you will get a nice error message.
It might be the first time on the program, I think, Rob, that the deprecated attribute was mentioned, which was added in C++ 11, I believe.
Right.
Yeah, and most people don't talk about it. Yeah. It's an interesting use of it.
Yeah.
So you're pretending like it's going to work by providing a deprecated function that will then cause a linker error later.
Right. So I do check it up front. So I can check at compile time whether this type will be creatable.
Right.
If it is creatable, then obviously I don't mark the function deprecated. I have 2 overloads. And if it's not creatable, I mark it deprecated. And then somewhere in the call stack, I'll get the other error message.
So just using regular overloading, if you happen to call the deprecated version, then we get the diagnostic, basically.
Yeah. And you happen to call the deprecated version if the type is not creatable. We just check that compile time.
So out of curiosity, have you given any thought to or proposed anything to the standard for something that would make this process easier and help you give better error messages?
Well, concept's supposed to help that, right?
Supposed to, but I don't know. People argue about that.
Right. So the problem with concept, I'd say, is the fact that you can easily get the error message up front, like with the deprecated, because that's what I kind of imitate. But why the constraint not satisfied might be actually a bit more difficult to achieve. So right now the Clang and GCC, the part of it which supports the concept, tell you kind of exactly from the first call stack why, but it's quite difficult to tell it in my 10 layers below I have this error because of something, and it's like propagate that up front and tell me about it. So yeah, it's not as good, but I think you can make it work as well. So it does a bit of more effort. And the other proposal is like the trace for constexpr, which kind of is basically the same as static assert, but without the call stack, right? And you can put the types on that. So that would be useful as well, like static printf kind of thing.
Debugging a compile time failure of a constexpr call can be difficult.
Agree.
So some tools to make that easier would be, at the moment, personally, I just convert it to a runtime call, then use the debugger to figure out what happened, because getting any real diagnostic at compile time is hard.
Yeah, totally agree. Usually you have to, I follow like TDD and trying to make like as small changes as possible so that I know what's going on. But yeah, I do it at runtime. I'm not trying to do it at compile time.
Right.
Was there anything else you want to talk about with DI before we move on to talking about the state machine library?
Sure. Just a small thing is, I also wanted to point out that with BoostDI, you can have also other benefits. It's a small core. It's like 2,000 lines of code. So it's really easy to add extensions. For example, a runtime injection is just an extension which you can write on top of the static compile time version, which is quite neat. And also you can use policies. So because you own the types creation kind of part of your application, you can, for example, imagine the situation where you would like to restrict types which can be injected. For example, I have a policy in the company that, for example, that do not allow raw pointers to be passed through the constructors because they're good practice, let's say, or something like that. Then you can do that with DI because you own that and you can write easily a policy for that. And the last part is that you can also create the mocks automatically. So you can imagine that if you have the testing part of it for TDD, you can say, create me this unit, and for all the polymorphic types, inject the mocks and create them, using like fakeit or GUnit. You can do that as well. You can create mocks without, using the mock method part of it, of Google mock. And you can have different configurations for production and testing. So yeah, just wanted to point that out that there are a lot of benefits of using DI.
Yeah, sounds like a powerful library.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to interrupt the discussion for just a moment to bring you a word from our sponsors. PVS Studio Analyzer detects a wide range of bugs. This is possible thanks to the combination of various techniques such as data flow analysis, symbolic execution, method annotations, and pattern-based matching analysis. PVS Studio team invites listeners to get acquainted with the article Technologies Used in the PVS Studio Code Analyzer for Finding Bugs and Potential Vulnerabilities, a link to which will be given in the podcast description. The article describes the analyzer's internal design principles and reveals the magic that allows detecting some types of bugs. So, do you want to tell us about SML?
Sure. So SML is a state machine library, which is kind of like, if you don't know what is a state machine, it's usually a model of computation, which kind of prevents the spaghetti code. So it's often a case in some production code that you have like if A and B and not C and D. If you have code like that, you probably would benefit from using a state machine library because that kind of makes it more declarative and you express what and not how. So that's the main benefit of using a state machine kind of part. And it's modeled by the Unified Model Language. So it's a standard for writing the state machines. And this currently like the version 2.5. It's kind of like the C++ standard. And it has multiple features on top of just the simple transitions, like def or history or other things which are not by default, important, but it's good to know that you can do more stuff with it. So that's about the state machine itself. And yeah, I actually wrote the boost again with the quotes SML library, which kind of try to implement the state machine.
I did not know that there was a standard for specifying state machine. It's
kind of the standard for specifying the diagrams for UML.
Okay.
So when you have the UML, you usually would like to have a standard way of defining the diagrams. And one of the diagrams is the state diagram, which kind of translates to the state machine. And the SML is kind of the declarative way of writing the same thing as the diagram. So you can have translation one-to-one. So for example, if you have planned UML state diagram, the code which you have to write for the boost SML is pretty much the same. Right. So that's quite neat. And you can easily, translate from planned UML to boost SML and vice versa.
Now, if I recall, you gave a talk on your SML library at CppCon 2018. Is that correct?
Yes, I gave a talk about, it was called State Machine Battlefield. So I kind of compared different approaches of writing state machine, including like if, switch, and using both libraries as well, coroutines, variant, which is quite popular as well recently. And moving kind of part of that is like, you may ask why we need another boost state machine library. Because we have two already in boost. One is called state chart and one is boost MSM. So the state chart is kind of oldish. I don't want to be offended here, but it's not as fancy as boost MSM. So I won't be talking about it because it's runtime. It uses virtual interfaces, dynamic allocations. It's not really as neat as boost MSM, which I find it extremely, extremely nice. However, it has a few problems. The main one, it's extremely slow to compile. It's like really slow because it's still using Boost MPL, like C++03, MPL vector kind of thing. It has tons of macros. It generates only jump table, and its error messages are terrible as well because of the MPL vector. And the binary size is not ideal either. So I was using Boost MSM before. I was like really happy with it until, I had to actually write a production state machine, which was a bit bigger than just the simple examples. And I wasn't able to do that. So, but I still wanted all the goodies out of it, which is the declarative style, which follows the UML. So yeah, I decided to write the SML, which actually compiles like 60 times faster than Boost MSM. So because it's just using modern C++, there's no that magic about it. It's just modern C++, variadic templates, const exprif or all the fold expression stuff it's just much faster than MPL. And also like libraries like Fuzzy or MPL11 as well. They're much faster than it used to be before. And one thing which I didn't like about MSM was the fact that, because I'm like in finance industry, so I care about the latency, and I weren't able to change the generated code out of MSM because there was no policy to do that. However, MSM has really good design. There's the different front end and different back end. So I actually kept the idea as well. However, the back end, which is at compile time, so you don't pay for what you don't use. If you don't use a UML feature in your transition table, which is part of the definition of your state machine, then it won't be even compiled in. So that's pretty handy, like don't pay for what you don't use. We all love that. But it only generates the jump table for you, which sometimes is good, but it's not the best always. Therefore, I added like a few policies to SML instead of just being coupled to one. And that's what I was actually referring at the talk at CppCon, that you have different ways of implementing state machines. You can do, switch, if else, fold expressions, coroutines, compute to go to jump tables. You have tons of ideas how to do that. And that's, for example, variant, as well. It's like, it's just runtime dispatching on events, right? So you can approach it many different ways. And that's what I wanted to add to the SML. So SML has different backend policies, which allows you to change them and experiment with them. And that gives like a lot of performance benefits for you, because you can easily switch how you want to tackle that.
All right.
Are either of these libraries used in any like released applications or projects?
Yeah. So they're used in the production. It's actually quite often that I'm asked whether they can be used, and yeah, they are. So a lot of latency. I can't really talk about the names that much, but sure. A few big names are using them, and they're using production because of the latency profile, as well as they improve the expressing the what, not the how. So they're quite handy. But there are different profiles and different companies which are using them. There are a lot, as I pointed out, there are a lot of latency profile companies which are interested in them because of the performance. However, in the same sentence, there are companies which do not care that much about the performance, but do care about the declarative part of it. But also they would like to change the ability to, for example, for DI, change the ability to add the bindings at runtime from config or something like that. So yeah, there are different use cases like for any libraries, and there are pros and cons of using them. It always depends on your use case, I guess.
Okay. Well, before we let you go, Kris, is there anything else you wanted to share? Do you want to give us your Twitter handle or blog or anything like that?
Sure. So, kind of a last word of wisdom, I'd say.
Sure.
Leverage zero-cost libraries as an idea for to consider for anyone who is willing to use libraries. We have this, idea in C++, don't pay for what you don't use, but it's often forgotten that we can develop libraries which we won't have to pay for anything as well. So if you can leverage them, I think that's a really good idea for everyone, because we don't want to repeat the code a lot of times. Yeah. And yeah, if you want to contact me, go for it. I have a Twitter. As I pointed out, if you want to be a review manager for any of those libraries, feel free to contact me too. My tweet is at Kris Jusiak. I guess, yeah, it's Kris with a K. And my GitHub is pretty much the same, so it will be really easy to find. And all the libraries are on GitHub. They're open source, obviously, on Post Experimental. And I wanted to point out that experimental is not really experimental, which means that those libraries are not experimental in like the ABI or anything. One change is just called experimental because they're not part of the boost.
Okay.
So maybe the better name would be staging or something like that. But yeah, that's the GitHub part of it.
Okay. Well, it's been great having you on the show today, Kris.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.
Okay.
All right.
Can all stop. Thanks so much for listening in as we chat about C++. We'd love to hear what you think of the podcast. Please let us know if we're discussing the stuff you're interested in, or if you have a suggestion for a topic, we'd love to hear about that too. You can email all your thoughts to feedback@cppcast.com. We'd also appreciate if you can like CppCast on Facebook and follow CppCast on Twitter. You can also follow me at Rob W. Irving and Jason at Lefticus on Twitter. We'd also like to thank all our patrons who help support the show through Patreon. If you'd like to support us on Patreon, you can do so at patreon.com/cppcast. And of course, you can find all that info and the show notes on the podcast website at cppcast.com. Theme music for this episode was provided by podcastthemes.com. At cppcast.com. Theme music for this episode was provided by podcastthemes.com.